What's up, everybody? This is Jay the Wanderer with Oakland Latinos Unidos, aka Oakland Latinos United, the voice of the Latino community in the Bay Area, California, YouTube, and beyond. Well, I'm on here with part 2 of the video I made, which was about an exhibit at the Oakland Museum, which was called The African Presence in Mexico, which was brought from Chicago, actually, from a museum out there called, I believe it's called the Chicago Mexican Art Museum or something like that. But they brought an exhibit to the Oakland Museum for everybody to see, which was about the little-known history of Africans in Mexico, of African slavery and African influences in Mexico. And it's basically an exhibit to show how people have forgotten over time that Mexico did have an African presence and had slaves from Africa, and to this day has an influence from those times. What you're looking at here is a map of Mexico, and it shows basically details where slavery originated in Mexico. If you can see right here, the state of Veracruz, which I've actually been there. It's on the east coast of Mexico, and it's basically the Gulf Coast or Caribbean coast. You could say either or. And basically, this was the main point of entry during Spanish times in Mexico. Slaves were brought in from Africa, which was up here, all the way across the Atlantic Ocean to Veracruz, and from here they were spread all over the central region of Mexico. Like I said Guerrero, Morelos, Mexico City, Michoacan, Zacatecas, other states where slaves were brought to, and have been documented to have been brought to work in various sugarcane plantations, copper mines, and many other things. Some work as ranch hands, as cowboys, and they had many uses for them. And like I said, the central part of Mexico is where you're going to find most of the people that have some type of African descendants in them, especially Veracruz and Costa Chica, Guerrero, and Oaxaca, which is a coastal region called Costa Chica that borders Oaxaca and Guerrero. Basically, Guerrero was a slave city, another slave city, because they were brought across, and this was an auction area. And many escaped slaves escaped south of Acapulco and settled this area, Costa Chica. This was an area settled by escaped slaves who hid out with indigenous tribes, just like I told you before about the Yanga rebellion in Veracruz. And basically to this day, Costa Chica has a large African population in it, and Veracruz does too. And Veracruz has names in towns that are of African origin, like Mozambique and Mandinga. And Mandinga obviously is the name of a tribe in Africa called the Mandinga tribe. And also, let's look at this state, Coahuila. There was also a group of escaped half black and half indigenous people called Black Seminoles. They were originally from Florida, which is up here, and they were kicked out of Florida and came into Oklahoma, I believe under, the Trail of Tears. And they were also kicked out of Oklahoma, so many of them were settled in Coahuila, in a state called El Nacimiento de los Negros, in a city called El Nacimiento de los Negros. They were given asylum by the Mexican government as long as they worked for the Mexican government and for the Mexican army. And they agreed to, and they were given land grants for this. Nacimiento, today, that area has a lot of people that are descendants of the Black Seminoles, and I believe they're called Moskugos or something like that. I read a little bit about it before. But also, let's look at this part of the U.S. again. Right here is the U.S., and right here, if it was drawn on here, this would be Louisiana, Mississippi, all the slave states, Texas, and during the Underground Railroad, a lot of escaped slaves escaped right here into Mexico. I mean, look at how close it was. Here's Louisiana, and here's Mississippi, and all those states. And it was just easy for them to just escape here than to go up north. Many of them came into Tamaulipas, Veracruz, Coahuila, and they hid out in many of these areas. And they mixed in with the people. And, you got to remember, at that time, slavery was still going on in the U.S., but not in Mexico. And let's go to that. This is our other people that are historical in Mexico, who had a lot to do with the history of Mexico and were of African descent. This man right here is Vicente Guerrero. Vicente Guerrero was the second president of Mexico, and the state of Guerrero is named after him today, where Acapulco is. It is said that he was of African, indigenous, and even Spanish blood or ancestry. He was the second president of Mexico, but I believe he was murdered a year or two after his presidency over, rivalries, political rivalries. He is actually the first president to abolish slavery in Mexico, which was like, 35 years before the U.S. did in 1830. He completely abolished slavery in Mexico and said there's not going to be no slavery in this country. So as you can see, Mexico was the first country to abolish all forms of slavery way before the U.S. Because you got to remember, also indigenous people were being used as slaves by the Spanish and Africans. Another person that was famous during this time was this man right here, Jose Maria Morelos. He was actually a priest from the state of Michoacan, which is where my mom is from, and it is said that he was of African, indigenous, and Spanish descent also. It's said that his grandma was a free black woman. I've read somewhere that it is documented. He was basically a priest who joined the revolution against Spain, the independent war against Spain, and he was captured by the Spanish and killed for treason against the Spanish crown. Another historical person in Mexico is this man right here. He was the last governor of California, and his name was Pio Pico, the last governor of Mexican California before the U.S. took it over. Pio Pico is said to have been half Spanish and half black, and it's said that his grandma had been a free slave. He had been the descendant of a free slave from Mexico, though, under Spanish rule. Pio Pico was the last governor of California, and if you look at the picture of him, he obviously looks like he would be an old black man with white hair. But he was the last California governor, and he was part black. So, that's another thing that a lot of people don't know. Many famous writers and artists who are African Americans spent time in Mexico and were inspired in Mexico to write. And many of them said they didn't feel too much discrimination in Mexico like they did here. One famous writer is this man right here, Langston Hughes, who's a famous African American poet and writer. He lived like 2 or 3 years in Mexico, and he said that in Mexico he never got discriminated against once as he did here in the U.S. And another person that's an artist also is this lady right here. Her name is Elizabeth Catlett. And she also moved to Mexico in the 1940s because she felt her work would be better appreciated in Mexico than in the U.S. And she actually married this man right here. I believe his name is Francisco Mora. And, she married a Mexican man and became a Mexican citizen and now lives in Mexico in the state of Morelos, which is the same state where Emiliano Zapata was from. And I believe that's her son. I think he's a musician now. I was reading something about that family. But as you can see, Africans in Mexico is nothing to be ashamed of. It's nothing to be worried about or ashamed of. Right here is a picture of a stamp dedicated, a postage stamp dedicated to Martin Luther King in 1969, a year after he died. The Mexican government made a postage stamp with Martin Luther King's face a year after he died. It dedicated basically, a stamp to Martin Luther King about 10 or 11 years before the U.S. actually did one. So, as you can see, there's history there to that too. But like I was saying, the history of blacks in Mexico is nothing you should be ashamed of. It's nothing you should fear. There's a big disconnect between African Americans, Chicanos and Mexicanos, and the African history of Latin America and Mexico in particular. See, to all my African American listeners, slavery didn't only just happen in the U.S. You would think it only happened in the South, in Louisiana, and, Mississippi, Georgia, whatever. But no, slavery actually happened all over the American continent. From Mexico all the way as far as Argentina and Uruguay. Brazil had many African slaves, even though they were brought by Portuguese, because that was a Portuguese-ruled country, which is in South America. But Brazil has the highest number of people of African descent in the American continent. Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, some parts of Bolivia, Venezuela. I can go on. Had people of African descent. Central America, Honduras, parts of Guatemala, Belize, parts of Nicaragua on the Caribbean coast has people of African descent. So slavery and African people do not only live in the U.S. I want all my African American listeners to understand this. There are people of African descent in Latin America and in Mexico also. Many people say, well, what happened to the blacks in Mexico? Like I said, what happened was there was a lot of race mixing. There was a lot of other things. There was a nationalistic identity that if you were born in Mexico, you were Mexican, no matter what color you were. That also plays into the role. But and it basically kind of made that African presence disappear over the years, and many people are ignorant of it until now that many people are researching it. But if you're in the Oakland area or the Bay Area, go check out this exhibit. It's going to be going on until August 23rd of 2009 at the Oakland Museum. Check out this really good exhibit. And, read more about this subject. If you are a Chicano, Mexicano, or African American, look it up. Look up Yanga. Look up Afro-Mexicans. Look up Veracruz. Look up many things. But I'm out of time. I'm going to leave links on these videos to other videos about black Mexicans so you can see. So, Jay the Wonder signing out.